17 years after the release of timeless classic Final Fantasy IV, Square released an episodic sequel, Final Fantasy IV The After Years. I don't think it's very good, and yet I'm oddly compelled to explain myself. I've been difficult this year. Trash Year has not been treating me well, and I wanted to step back a little bit, refresh, and look maybe more fairly on my own interests. I'm a big Final Fantasy fan, obviously, but absent my frustrations with, Rebirth and Crisis Core, which are both well documented, I genuinely feel like the After Years is bad, but in a pretty interesting way. The problem is that it's basically non-existent in the cultural mind, another issue I keep brushing up against this year, but I am an artist and principled, even if it's just a principled hater, and I refuse to compromise myself just because it's bad for engagement. So, we're going to learn a lot about this old, weird, kind of bad Final Fantasy, and in doing so, I hope you can all figure out more about what I think makes games in these series good or bad beyond the general assumption that modern Final Fantasy, whatever that is these days, is just inherently bad. I'm sure that's not going to come up later. Final Fantasy, mechanically, has long been a fan of reinvention, no matter how many think pieces are written about how it needs to pick a lane and develop it, and that spirit of reinvention even creeps into spin-offs and derivative titles. Lightning Returns, for example, plays very differently to Final Fantasy XIII. Revenant Wings is an RTS game, despite being a direct sequel to Final Fantasy XII, which is only almost an RTS game. Related titles often get to share little qualities and similarities to each other. It's nice. However, the After Years is very, very closely related to its source material mechanically. ATB returns from its 17-year journey through the series practically unchanged from its origin point. The After Years contributes some novelty, of course. There's a new moon mechanic, which alters the potency of different categories of attacks, and band attacks, where characters team up to do a big super attack that's usually not super worth it. That's all fine enough, but this echoing of its predecessor can be a nice reminder of an old classic, but its adherence to its source material is also kind of the game's downfall. Just looking at the game strictly through its gameplay, a large portion of your time is spent rehashing dungeons, sequences, and boss fights from the original title. You have different party members, sure, but by and large, you're kind of just redoing Final Fantasy IV again. What new content is there for most of the series are kind of nondescript. Little dungeons that feel completely in tune with the usual fare for Final Fantasy IV, enough so that despite there technically being a lot of new dungeons in After Years, the vibe never really departs from the source material until the very end. These two elements, repeated levels, bosses, gameplay, with only small changes in mechanics, makes it really hard for the game to shine on its own terms. Even the bulk of the story stuff we'll get into later tends to just drift into characters sitting around telling each other how these things all happened before and are happening again. Edward has to journey to get the Sand Ruby from the Antlion's Den. There's an evil force from Baron trying to gather the crystals. Rydia's lost her family again. The Magnet Cave functions as before, complete with fighting the Dark Elf again. For thoroughness, I played Final Fantasy IV Interlude, a mid-quill minigame that's about 2 hours of meandering through old dungeons to learn that Cecil and Yang get pregnant, and there is a mysterious Rydia impersonator. In it, Edge does the trick to sneak into the Tower of Babel, a thing that he did in the original game, and now, again, in the After Years. He escapes the tower by flying out of it, courtesy of the timely arrival of an airship, just as before. It's also frustrating to take in lump sum, because the game mechanically encourages the idea that it doesn't really have anything particularly new to bring to the table. The game functions and plays about the same, just with more padding, more stuff, and constant references back to its predecessor. Bleh. Now, that's not all, is it? One of my favorite games of all time is Persona 2: Eternal Punishment, a game that largely rehashes the same mechanics and dungeons of its previous title, Persona 2: Innocent Sim. And that is largely due to the game's kind of exceptional commitment to its vision of depicting a parallel reality that's slowly going more and more wrong the harder your party tries to figure out the truth. It's not exactly a smooth transition to go from one game right into the next, and After Years was released episodically, 17 years after the release of FF4, so this blasting through each of these stories in short order, that's probably not the intended way to play it, right? Surely there's something going on here that I'm not being charitable about. 17 years ago, our intrepid heroes saved the world by traveling to the moon and destroying evil. Then they all settled down, inherited the various thrones left behind, raised families, grew up, and are now faced with a bizarre remixing of their pasts. Cecil is forced this time to play the evil king now, body stripped of its autonomy and mind, a puppet to a force that compels him to seize the crystals. Instead of a story of redemption, a dark knight ascending into a paladin, his son has to escape with the help of a mysterious gentleman, who even traveled to Mist in an echoing of the original game. Again, the mechanical trappings of this being kind of a love letter celebration of classic SNES title Final Fantasy IV continues to drag the game's ideas through the mud. We can't just have a story about Yang trying to not be a terrible father to his daughter Ursula. It has to also be the Fabul invasion sequence. Remember that? The sad reality of it is that no matter what, the game seems resistant to being interesting. Palom and Porom were little kids in the original game, a small, quirky part of the original, and now, 17 years later, Palom is bafflingly an angsty teen, or at least acts like one. Dour, cynical, has weird things to say about women, and determined to be a sage like Tello without seemingly investing too much in the actual effort it would take to do such a thing. He gets to teach a young Epopt of Troya, Leonora, and in doing so it reveals that he's also in the center of a weird love triangle. Porom, meanwhile, has stayed behind, tending to the elder, seemingly intended to take his place one day, while her brother gets to travel and live out his ambitious dreams. These are potentially quite interesting angles to have for both characters, but also, we can't really spend much time on them at all, since Palom has to redo the Magnet Cave, and Porom gets to redo Cecil's journey up Mount Ordeals, though it's okay. Kain gets to also, and have one of the few novel additions to the game by replaying the invasion of Mysidia from the victim's perspective. Hey, while we brought up Kain, he does actually contribute to one of the better parts of the game. See, Kain goes through his own Mount Ordeals, I already said this, but when he gets to the top and confronts his darkness, his dark side wins and goes free. I guess it just lingers on Mount Ordeals for like 17 years until Porom guides him to Mysidia, but hey, that's neat. Kain sheds his old life, his name, his identity, and wanders the world in shame, only to be the same gentleman Mysterious that rescues Theodore. See, it really is just FF4 again. Kain's back, but in confronting his darker half at the pinnacle of all things, with the Mysterious Girl's plan almost at its fruition, he ascends, a holy dragoon, finally accepting the parts of him he's been trying to crush. How very Persona 4. Nearing the end of the game is where After Years finally actually does start to find itself. All the weird episodic threads running through the game start to coalesce, for as boring and bad as Edward's tale was, Edward himself actually kind of owns in this game. I mean, he's fine as a unit or whatever, kind of a support back row type, but, like, he also does just some straight up espionage shit. Hidden communication devices, evil Cecil gives him a bomb ring to accidentally burn Dansim to the ground, only for Edward to foresee it and wait until evil Kain tries to kill him for his crystal, where he unleashes the bombs on him in a big, desperate bid to stop him. Like, once this game has figured out how to care about itself, suddenly things start going crazy. The new moon is starting to crash into the planet, your party is built out of the last few people still left standing and ready to fight, with Theodore's group getting hung up fighting evil Cecil. Rydia, Edge, Golbez, and Luca have to go around and pull everyone else out of their fire before converging on Baron Castle, where they rescue Cecil, raise the Lunar Whale, and all together go to the final dungeon, a massive, sprawling labyrinth of floors peppered with bosses from the original game. Again, oh, boy, great, good, cool, awesome, love it. What's a bitch to do about this? Every turn the game takes to really become itself is when it's at its most interesting, but the gravitational pull of Final Fantasy IV continues to hold it down. You can see it, these little scenes where they want to express the new cast's capabilities, how they will be the hope for the future, but the game mechanically leans too heavy on encounters that encourage legacy characters. Edge gets a one-on-one, Rydia keeps Leviathan and Najora alive, you have to bring Cecil into the Cecil fight, and they're often given equipment that's just tailor-made to be good for them, so obviously I had to resist this tendency and make a #YesWeCanFeminism team out of all the new girls I could fit and Rydia. Despite its ambitions, the friction the game has in letting you actually enjoy the new cast carries over into everything. They can't mechanically justify this because they made the choice to bring in the entire original cast, and maybe because it would be nice to see the endgame progression of some of the characters that didn't make it into the final party, but regardless, it left the entire cast in, and that is also going to be the prime motivating factor to get people to download this game on their WiiWare. I have no idea how WiiWare worked, despite owning 3 of them at one point, but in doing so, there's only so much space in your party, and the new characters are, generously speaking, an investment. Let's talk about Leonora. So, this is Leonora. She's your sage character, like Tellah and Fusoya from the original game, where she learns both black and white magic, but is generally more frail and has less MP. So far, so good. Thing is, Leonora is learning second-tier attack spells around the same time Iridia and Palom are learning their third-tier spells. She actually doesn't learn Firaga, for example, until level 78. You're beating the base game in your 60s, for context. She is versatile, but not really. Practically, her involvement in your party, should you choose to make a hashtag YesWhoCan feminism team out of all the new girls in Iridia, will be a less good white mage than the other 2 options you have, but technically better than other healers like Cecil and Kain, both of which are not made to be healers anyway, or Theodore and Brina, 2 new characters that are bad at healing despite technically being more capable of doing so. They even made this work with Golbez, technically a new party member whose whole thing is joining at a high level with good stats as both a physical attacker and black mage, who could end up dead if you play poorly. There just is no real way to justify bringing in the new talent. The story doesn't really care about them. The gameplay largely favors the cast that comes in strong and gets stronger over extreme late bloomers like Izayoi or Leonora, or the characters that are borderline non-viable like the Calcabrina dolls or Harley. Luca and Ursula and Theodore and Golbez are the only ones that can threaten to overcome these challenges narratively and mechanically, but there just isn't much to justify using them over big star hitters like Kain, Edge, Cecil, or Iridia. Like the tendency to just end up in the final party from the original title again is just there, only hindered by Cecil being horrendously bad until near the end part of the final dungeon of the game. And yet, I keep thinking about this game. Near the very end, the story behind the mysterious girls starts to come through, that they are a gestalt collection from this unfathomably advanced being known simply as the Creator. He explains that the crystals are tools to help develop sentient life as some kind of experiment, and that they have deemed the experiment a failure. Our party fights against the very power that created them in the first place, choosing to defy this fate and return to the peaceful lives they carved out for themselves, and the culminating feelings are wildly polarizing for me. It feels like kind of a bizarre twist to just try and turn all the whimsical, thematically potent, if a bit simple ideas from the original title into a kind of B-movie sci-fi plot, suddenly making this pristine story into something that feels vaguely cold. This is further complicated by the few final boss fights mostly being fun references from previous FF titles, painting the grand finale of this title as little more than a big, fun bit of fan service. Cecil has a son, Yang has a daughter, Edge and Iridia is canon, Kain gets a redemption arc. It all feels very masturbatory, but I can't help but think about the weird bits of friction the game has. You know, it's a bad idea to invest in Izayoi or Leonora, sure, but that didn't stop me anyway, because, I don't know, at least Leonora has some kind of an arc to her. No one in this game really gets to have a serious bit of storytelling weight outside of the legacy cast and Theodore, but Leonora's little bits paint an interesting dimension to the world. And she feels very much like the heart and soul of the new generation. There is no way she can compare to our faves, but she's here, and you can make her fight the final boss, because this is her planet too, and in the depths of the cold sci-fi nonsense, there is just a little glimmer of something. See, oftentimes stories will be about something textually and explicitly, but that thing isn't really supposed to only be considered on its own terms, because it also means something else. As much as the cold plot of Final Fantasy IV: The Afteryears is about a sci-fi futuristic super race doing experiments on primitive life forms, the final boss named the Creator, and in fighting through a slew of iconic bosses from the other titles, the implication is trying to shoot for something. This isn't just a sci-fi flick, but an assertion that these characters, their love for the world, their undeniable light is strong enough to reject any force that comes to crush it. They can prevail against anything, even the desires of their own creators, demanding that they once again play their old roles, be their old selves forever, repeat the cycle again to ensure that their fate is what it was meant to be. Did they accomplish this? Do I think they did a good job exploring this idea? Well, no. I can appreciate it. I can enjoy the effort. I can find endless amusement in building silly parties and grinding and making characters strong beyond their narrative means, but I cannot in good conscience say that Final Fantasy IV The After Years is a good Final Fantasy, even if I ended up kind of liking it on a second pass. And I guess that's it for this one. I don't look at the runtime, just that's it now. Thank you all for watching. Sorry to be just a downer about a Final Fantasy title that no one cares about. Hey, if you like, just pretend that I gave the same speech I gave at the end of my Pokemon Legends vid, or my Cyberpunk one about remembering art, the transient nature of culture, and how it all fades away and whatnot. I'm just gonna take a moment. The year has been really difficult, and I just wanted a lighter, easier video this month as a breather. So, yeah. Hey, did anyone finish playing Final Fantasy XVI? So, apparently, Final Fantasy XVI is a story about how slavery is wrong and nothing else, according to Polygon and also some friends of mine. The game is pretty widely recognized as taking inspiration from Game of Thrones, that TV show that happened, I guess. Yoshi P, I guess, was really a fan, and from word go, the game had been picked apart on any detail that could be mined from it. People have complained about the lack of clear diversity in the game, from early footage showing one particularly white country, to articles about how the queer characters in this game are bad, actually. Sometimes even from publications that would go on to praise the queer inclusion in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, featuring unnamed NPC woman with stock animation cycles and nothing else. That's their full names, believe me, they're married. Stretching on and on into articles about how the game is sexist because Jill doesn't have the kind of agency and presence Clive has, that the game's combat is exhausting and tedious, that the story doesn't make any sense, or critically, that the story's vision, its aim, is surface level and incurious. Final Fantasy XVI is a game about how slavery is bad and nothing else. An admirable goal in its own rights, sure. Metaphor ReFantagio is, in a way, a game about how racism is bad, actually, and people, including me, are really into that. But I balk at this. I don't think there's been a Final Fantasy that's quite that shallow and simplistic in its vision since, like, maybe Final Fantasy III? This is a series that speaks in huge, broad strokes to reach big thematic ideas. To read so little into the game at first reeks of something. I want to say insincerity, but I wouldn't read that into every iteration of this take. I do get the frustration in all of this, but it's a frustration that eschews the series' history with how it grapples with its literary ideas. Like, okay, yes, it is undeniable that the Branded are a pretty simplistic vision of slavery. Clive goes through it, but only as a background context in service to his far more grandiose storyline. It's not something that's given a lot of texture and granularity that isn't kind of luxuriating in the brutality of it. This is further complicated by the game's tendency towards the violent in general. Blood flies everywhere, characters say fuck and mispronounce chocobos.
That chocobo.
The high cho.
Overall, I can understand the frustration. Slavery, in the real world, is way more complex and far less glamorous a thing, but to bear fully down on this as the singular talking point of the game misses the vision that it's actually going for and brushes up against a trend in media criticism that I kind of resist. So, okay. All art is political, as a term has been wrung out over the years of people bickering over it, me included, and I feel like enough people in the world has already also explained that it doesn't mean that every piece of art is itself an advocacy piece for an explicitly stated political goal. But If you haven't thought about that or heard this until now, congrats. This is for you. I'm going to step a little bit further, though, and resist the urge to turn art's political trappings into the highlight feature of art. Yes, there are politics to be found in all art, but even recognizing that it may not be straightforward or explicit, but still making it the focal point all the same, it diminishes the importance and dignity of art. Final Fantasy XVI, clumsy as this message may be, depicts the kind of crass, overly broad version of slavery to add to the layer cake of the idea that systems of power will turn people into beasts and then demonize them as the very monsters they're made into.
You're right. I am a monster, and my soul is stained black. Though not by ether, but by the evil of men like you, who made me close my heart and drown in darkness when I should have raged against it. This is my penance. I will be your monster no more. Nor will I suffer you to create another.
This is also why Final Fantasy VI is accidentally a dog boy game. I don't have time to get into that in this video. Please look forward to a deep, unhinged, furry read of Final Fantasy XVI sometime in the future. Now, as much as I want to keep on talking about Final Fantasy XVI, I think that this kind of discourse has roots a little deeper than major journalism publications finding excuses to be rude to it. There is a de facto idea that modern Final Fantasy is bad, an idea that remained evergreen up until a few years ago, where it shifted into modern Final Fantasy that isn't a remake is bad. 16 came out to polarized reviews, some which are rather petty, sure, but FF15, 14, at least 1.0, 13, and even 12 came out to these kinds of deeply mixed receptions. Modern Final Fantasy is incoherent, bloated, convoluted, has bad gameplay, bad storytelling, and the only really real addendums to it have been remakes of legacy titles. In pulling apart Final Fantasy XVI, to its most basic elements to be scrutinized over, misses the actual thematic point the game is trying to make, but it makes for easy fodder, and that's a behavior pattern I've seen for years and years of releases. FF13 is nonsensical because they don't have a Tidus here asking you in-game what a l'Cie is. FF15 is bad because it's unfinished and we need increasingly bad DLC to finish the story. None of these complaints engage seriously with the art, the actual game, the story they're trying to express, and I cannot be party to that as the metric we use to gauge what makes a bad Final Fantasy. Looking back at After Years, I have been asking myself what I find upsetting or disappointing in these games. I have a bizarre burden here as someone who loves every main series entry, including highly criticized titles like 2, or 8, or 12, or 13, or 14, or 15, or 16, but I'm not immune to the idea of a bad Final Fantasy. I think Rebirth is bad, Crisis Core is bad, and After Years is bad, even though I hold kind of a weird affection for them all. I think the critical failings of each of these titles are, frankly, that they're a little too in love with their source material, and too much that they can't escape the original game's gravity. And it's weird to be in this position, because the current landscape of AAA gaming is enamored with nostalgia. FF7 Remake being praised for its adoration of its source material, Pokemon remakes chastised for not being enough like their originals, the wretched fans of Fire Emblem begging for years for more remakes. Look, I really like FF16, but even it is in love with its source material, in love with the novelty of giving the initial summon spirit, Ifrit, basically a fire spell with prettier animations, the ability to save the world. And while I think that's rad and transcends the source material in a fun way, the broader point stands. Ultimately, what makes a bad Final Fantasy isn't much different than anyone's subjective taste, but critical reception often tries to construct an objective framework, ways to entrench and depersonalize their own opinions to protect themselves from disagreement. You can disagree with my metric all you want. I'm a grown-up, I can handle it, but I feel like I've been fighting an uphill battle against a bandwagon approach to a series that I love because it is daring and bold with itself, that it seeks to reinvent its own world, characters, gameplay, everything, because it's not always the most refined, the best conceived. Each stumble is treated like indelible proof that the game, if not the entire genre itself, it cannot get out of everything bad about video games. The more discourse around games descends into using art as a cudgel to insist upon cultural values, the less art gets to mean anything. Maybe I'm just a freak for caring about this, considering that almost every year without fail we get some article paraded around social media praising a new JRPG for breaking from tradition by not sucking. If I really wanted to, really wanted to go out of my way to dig into this idea, where it came from, why games I love in a genre I love are often given this kind of treatment, I don't know, I'd have to do something crazy, right? Like, go out on the internet and say that Chrono Trigger isn't as good as people say it is. I never do that, right? Special thanks to Alexi Angelica, Athena Stripes, Bees Louise, Blair Renix, Blueberries in My Coffee, Colleen T, Evan Kearns, Foxy Hex, Gail Simmons, Grizz, Lewis Wells, Low Res, Maria Aladren, Michael McNay, Mocha Lappin, Nariah the Redmarked, Noun Verbally, Professor Bopper, Saint Rawberry, Trade Good, Valerian Wraithwall, and Zetetic. Thank you all so much.